Welcome back to another tutorial. Here we have a jar of some sort of sugary treat. Today we're going to be talking about local adjustments. And I've already done a little bit of cropping to the image, as well as a little bit, no, didn't mean to zoom in there, a little bit of cropping, and I've adjusted using the Auto AI or AI Auto. And I selected the ON1 standard profile. So if you're in ON1 Photo Raw, you're going to click on local, and this is going to bring you to your local adjustment. And local adjustments are specific to one area. I've already talked about it in the podcast, and one of the demonstrations or illustrations that I gave was to desaturate one given area. The area that I want to desaturate, because I feel like this is just too yellow right now, is right here. So what I'm going to do is come up here to my masking, my local masking option. And in this drop down window, we get a few different shapes. We get linear, and these are all of the gradient tools. And technically a radial filter is also a gradient tool. It's just in the shape of a circle. I'm going to click on vignette, and I'm just going to click in this area, and you're going to see that. And let me make this a little bit smaller. I'll bring it into the center here. So here I have a radial filter, or a radial or a circular gradient, however you want to look at it, right? And I have in my adjustment panel the exposure pulled down, and I'm going to make some extreme edits here so you can really see what I'm talking about when I say local adjustments and how you can really use this. Right now, the area that's getting affected, the local area, is everything outside of this circle here. And I don't know if it's going to come through on YouTube, but you can definitely see the further I move away from where my mouse is now, it starts to get darker until it reaches the full negative 3.2 adjustment that I've made in the local adjustment panel. That ends up all the way out here. All right. Now, this is not the effect that I'm going for. So one of the things, if you're in ON1 Photo Raw, all you have to do is invert your selection invert your mask, which is still a selection, in order to get the effect from the panel to pop up on screen. So now I'm only affecting the inside portion of the circle. So wherever I move this effect goes along with it. This is where local adjustments really come into play. And the way that I'm going to use this, as I mentioned before, was desaturating a particular area. All right. So I'm going to drag that there, and then I need this to be a little bit longer. And it doesn't have to be entirely perfect, because I'm going to show you how to clean up your mask a little bit if you run into this issue. Now, I do know that in Lightroom, you can do the exact same thing. It's called the Radial filter. I use these filters all the time. It's my favorite way of editing photos. So like I said, all I want to do is desaturate this a bit. So I'm just going to come over here to my saturation slider. I'm going to pull this down. I pull it down a lot to see how drastic of an effect I can get and just how much I really want. And then I bring it back. So I go overboard, and then I bring it back to taste. And again, I don't want to make this super unsaturated. I just want to take away some of the attention. And I think that's about right. Okay. Your numbers and however you choose to desaturate, that's going to be very specific for you. But if you notice, I have some of this desaturation happening over here on the jar, and I don't want that. Okay. So what I'm going to do to clean up this mask a bit is I am going to darken that selection as well, so I can really see what I need to clean up. Now, if you were listening to the podcast, you'll realize that I saved the brush for cleanup. And this is what I meant by you'll use the brush to clean up your selections. So now I'm going to select my brush tool, and I'm going to have a feather really, really high. I want the opacity to be low. Oh, I'm sorry, high. And I want the flow to be fairly low. And all I'm going to do is make a brush about the size of the selected area that I want to clean up, which is right here. And I'm going to try it. I need to hit Shift X to go to paint out because I want to paint away this effect. And I was on paint in. So if you are on another program, you're going to want to make sure that you invert to paint the opposite of whatever it is that you were doing, or the adjustment that you made. Now, what I have, as you can see, I'm starting to remove, and I don't know, let me make it a little bit darker so it's really obvious what I'm doing here. Yeah. So as you can see around the edge of this jar here, and I'm not worried about it being entirely perfect, especially for the sake of the tutorial, because subtle changes and what you want to do is make adjustments that are realistic, right? That yellow could have absolutely been a little bit more desaturated. It could have been more saturated. I'm going to go ahead and leave that as it is. I'm going to hit Shift X and paint in again. All right. So what I want to do here now is really just clean up these areas. Because it was a circle, I didn't get anywhere over here. So I'm just going to paint in right here. And again, I'm only painting with it being black so you can see what I'm doing. This is just a way for me to know that I made the selection around this area, and I'm going to desaturate everywhere that I want it to desaturate. And I'm painting again with a low flow because I don't want this to be an abrupt and very harsh adjustment. So now when I go back to exposure, that area is desaturated all the way over here. And then you hit the button on and off. It's really saturated. I turn it on. It's less saturated. It's not asking for so much attention over here. And I can really focus what I want people to see over here. All right, my next adjustment. And for the sake of this tutorial, I will show you another way of dealing with this situation. Probably a lot easier. So I'm going to add an adjustment. And this time I'm going to go to selecting one of the gradient tools, the linear gradient tools. If you listen to the podcast, I mentioned that you can go from left to right, top to bottom, or diagonal across an image and make an adjustment really, really fast and really easy. Of note, in Lightroom, or I'm sorry, ON1 Photo Raw, anything that has white on it means that it's going to show your adjustment in that area. And if it has black on it, it means it's going to hide or protect the adjustment from going into that area. Because I want to adjust the right side of my screen, I need linear left. Don't read the names. I'm sorry. I recommend that you don't read the names. Just look at the diagram, and if you hover over it, because sometimes it's hard to see where the black line is, and it also really doesn't matter because you can invert the mask. But just know that white reveals and black conceals. And since I want the effect to show up here, I'm going to click right about there. And as you can see, I've made the adjustment to the right side of my image. And then I'm just going to click and drag this over a little bit. And again, I'm going to really make this adjustment. Now, the difference with the linear tool versus the gradient tool, or the circular gradient tool, I should say, is, and make a very extreme adjustment here. This is pure negative 4.2 adjustment made. And then this is negative 4.1 all the way up to whatever half of that would be. And then the other half of 4 or whatever the remainder is up to 0. And then no adjustments are happening here. So I'm getting adjustment 100% of whatever I make inside of this panel. Halfway from half of the adjustment is happening between here and here, and then the other half of the adjustment is happening between here and here, all the way down to 0. So it's a very smooth gradient. Now, this does a much better job for what we were trying to do before, of removing some of that saturation in the area over here. One of the reasons that you may or may not want to use the gradient tool or the linear gradient tool is for this reason right here, where you only get to half the adjustment. If you want the full effect of an adjustment, I recommend that you go with the radial tool. And I'll just hide these two. So this is with the radial adjustment. It's 100% affecting in this area. Sorry, I had the other one selected there. It's 100% adjusting this area right here, as opposed to fading in from the right and coming all the way across. Both are 100% acceptable. And when you combine the two, you might, really get a good look. So that's another tip. Combine your local adjustments to build the effect that you ultimately want. Now, again, I'm not going to run the linear gradient tool on this one, because I think the circular one did what I wanted it to do, and it worked out just fine. However, I'll delete this adjustment, and I'm going to add another adjustment, and I am going to use, and just bear with me for 1 second. It's always good if you have the ability to name whatever adjustments you're making, especially if you end up making more than you probably expect. I highly recommend that you do that. So I'm going to use the linear left, and I'm going to click right there. As you can see, it made the adjustment to the right-hand side of the monitor or of the photo. I don't want that, so I'm just going to invert it, and guess what? Now my adjustment is on the left-hand side. Now, I have the same concern about saturation here. Again, this is all about being able to draw the viewer's attention into the hero of the shot, which is very obvious in this photo, which is why I chose it. To really illustrate the point that I made in the podcast, that we want to draw the viewer's attention to the thing in the shot, but also leave them a little bit of context clues as to what else is going on. Now, would you know that this is candy or anything of the sort? No, but there's other round shapes here that can lead you to draw some conclusions about the location. Be it as they made true or false, doesn't really matter. It's really just context clues to keep the viewer engaged with the photo, but making sure that you're intentional about getting their attention on the main subject here. All right, it's enough of that. What I'm going to do is actually exactly what it is. I always go with a -1 exposure when I use the gradient tools or really almost any of the tools, because again, I want to draw the viewer's attention into where the hero is. So if I wanted to darken this down, and you can even darken this down if I wanted to put some text and be like, hey, sugary candy with an arrow, that could work, but I don't want it that dark. So I'll just bring it down. I guess for this image, it looks like -1.3 really helps highlight this section right here. And if I turn this on and off, you can see that now, as a viewer, the attention goes here. We have some yellows right in here that are a little bit more saturated, or a lot more saturated, than the yellows that are over here. I'll show you one last tool, and that is the brush tool. In ON1 Photo Raw, when you click on the mask, you get some really, really strong or really powerful tools at your disposal. One of those tools is color range. So when I turn this on, what it's looking for is the color that's inside of this box. Well, I don't necessarily need it to look for that color, so I'm going to hit the eyedropper tool, and I want it to find that color. So now it's masking, and I'll let you see the mask here. Anything that's lighter all the way up to white means that the effect that I'm applying to the shot is showing, and anything that's in black, it's not showing, as we talked about earlier. I don't really care for any of what's going on there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to increase the range, or I guess decrease, because I want this to be in less areas right now. Okay. And then what I'm going to do is turn this mask off. And I don't need this to be on exposure, but for the sake of everyone being able to see what's happening here, I have most of this yellow over here selected. There's some pieces that aren't selected, so I need to make sure that I'm on paint in. And then I'm just going to hover over this area, and I am going to paint in on the areas that I'm missing. So I'll speed through this a little bit. Now, that looks terrible right now, and that's because of the adjustment that I made, which is exposure. In fact, I am going to clean up just a little bit. I'm going to make this 100% and hit Shift X to paint out. And I'm going to make my flow 100% because I only want it in that area. All right. So flow 100%, Shift X to paint out. And I want to get rid of all of these areas that are not the yellow on the jar. And I'll leave it, if it's on the jar, I will leave it because it's on the jar. But all of this over here, I don't want to affect. And this pole, I don't want to affect because I've already made my adjustment and I'm happy with the saturation on that pole. So now I'm going to hit view again to turn off that mask preview. I can close the mask now and go back to my adjustments here. I'll double click to reset the exposure, and then I'm just going to come down to saturation again, and I'm going to bring that, like I said in the last time I did it, pull the saturation down pretty far, and then I'm just going to walk it back up until I start to see some of the yellow. And it's okay if this yellow's a little bit brighter than what was over here. I'm okay with that. If you're using ON1 Photo Raw, you can use the effects module to really hone in and make some interesting images. I hope you guys found this tutorial helpful and you're enjoying the podcast. If you're not on the podcast, or if you haven't heard the podcast, it's Free Will Photos on most popular platforms. So if you're in the podcast, go ahead and give it a listen. Check it out. But until the next time, I want you guys to stay inspired and keep creating. Peace.